Hello, I'm Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, earlier we talked about how the cattle farmer and rancher's share of every dollar consumers spend on beef has been decreasing, even while demand for beef and beef exports have been strong. We also talked about how the globalist beef packers are importing beef at a rate that outpaces exports. And we discussed why the beef industry's claim that imports do not compete with U.S. beef because they're mostly a lower quality grinding product is simply false. So let's look at historical beef trade volumes and see if we can determine if beef imports have been used by the globalist beef packers to manage the price of domestic cattle. And we'll start with the hypothesis that if the globalist beef packers increase their importation of foreign beef when domestic cattle prices are rising, then those imports will effectively suppress those rising domestic cattle prices. And now we'll apply this hypothesis to actual events beginning in the early 2000s. You see, cattle prices were rising in early 2000. And then about mid-2003, a case of BSE or mad cow disease was discovered in Canada's cattle herd. Now, this effectively closed many of Canada's beef export markets. And the U.S. closed its border to imported live cattle from Canada for over 2 years. And within just a few months, domestic fed cattle prices began rising significantly, peaking in November and December of that year. But beginning just before domestic fed cattle prices peaked at the end of 2003, the volume of monthly beef imports began increasing dramatically, and they peaked to the highest level in history by June of 2005, which was just before the reopening of the border to Canadian live cattle. So under the pressure of the significantly increased monthly beef imports that lasted for a couple years, domestic fed cattle prices leveled off from their upward trend that had started early in the 2000s decade. And after reaching their peak in 2005, monthly beef imports began trending downward for several years, until about the fall of 2013, which was soon after mandatory country of origin labeling for beef was fully implemented. But the domestic beef cattle herd began shrinking around 2007 and fell to a 70-year low by 2014. And from 2014 through most of 2015, beef imports surged again. And cattle prices, of course, were responding favorably to the tighter supplies. So we had both cattle supplies and beef imports rising swiftly, until they didn't. Throughout 2015 and most of 2016, cattle prices collapsed further and faster than at any time in history. And once domestic cattle prices collapsed, monthly beef imports declined too. So applying the hypothesis, it appears there was a strong correlation between increasing monthly beef imports and downward pressure on domestic cattle prices for the 16-year period from 2000 through 2016. But this strong correlation became even more pronounced after 2016. From 2016 through today, there have been 6 obvious peaks in domestic cattle prices, and each of those 6 peaks was associated with monthly import surges. By mid-2020, monthly imports surged to almost the same volume as when they peaked in 2005. So you ask why increasing domestic cattle prices cannot be sustained? Well, you may want to look closely at the timing of monthly import surges. And very importantly, we're not the only ones who have identified this strong correlation between rising monthly beef imports and falling monthly domestic cattle prices. In fact, last year, a bipartisan group of 28 U.S. senators and House members wrote the U.S. Attorney General asking him to determine the impacts of imports on the domestic beef supply chain. In their letter, the congressional members stated that one potential explanation for why inflated beef prices were disconnected from cattle prices may be the ability of meat packers to import beef from foreign countries, either through external sources or their own vertically integrated sources. Now, the letter goes on to state that based on government data, as the price increases for live cattle, there is a subsequent and consistent increase experienced in beef importation. Furthermore, the letter said, the initiation of plummeting prices in the live cattle market appears to correspond almost exactly with the repeal of mandatory country of origin labeling, which demonstrates the negative impacts of imports on domestic beef prices. Now, you can help to stop the globalist beef packers from using imported cattle and beef to manage the price of domestic cattle by calling on your 2 U.S. senators and your U.S. representative to pass mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. Now, Senate Bill 2716 and House Bill 7291 will do that. But to get them passed, we need you to keep calling your congressional delegation until they do. So please join with us and go to our website at labelOurBeef.com to learn more. Thank you and have a productive week. Goodbye.